So says Sarah Polley, the writer and producer behind the new Netflix adaptation of Margaret Atwood's 1996 novel. The work of historical fiction revolves around the titular Grace Marks, a 19th-century servant accused of brutally murdering the master of her household and his mistress, a fellow housekeeper, with the help of a stable hand. The real-life crime rocked upper Canada in 1843, hurling the Victorian community into a salacious trial that amounted to a life sentence for Marks and a hanging for her accomplice. After 30 years in prison, Grace was eventually pardoned, but her exoneration was a mere consolation prize after decades of living as a notorious woman. Murderous is a strong word to have attached to you, Marks says in Atwood's book. It has a smell to it, that word, musky and oppressive, like dead flowers in a vase. Sometimes at night I whisper it over to myself, murderous, murderous. It rustles, like a taffeta skirt across the floor. Polley brought the beloved Atwoodian tale to life with the help of acclaimed American Psycho director Polley-Harron. Together, they created a 6-episode mini-series that places Marks, expertly played by Sarah Godin, as its center of gravity. She at times appears powerless, the product of poverty and neglect forced into an unforgiving life of servitude, and at other times as a careless and deliberate enigma, driven by an internal force we've yet to understand. Is she a cold-blooded killer, or a unduly scorned castaway? Both Atwood and the Polley-Harron adaptation team shy away from answering that question. Instead, the new Netflix series is at its best when it sinks into the historic details that complicate Mark's narrative. In the show's meticulously crafted world, an echo of real 19th-century horrors, lower-class women are relegated to sexual prey, cast as the constant targets of unwanted advances and the unfortunate recipients of botched abortions. Indeed, if Handmaid's Tale is the fundamentalist dystopia of our future, Alias Grace makes it its mission to paint a clear picture of the overlooked history that would make Gilead possible. We spoke to Harron ahead of the show's premiere on November 3rd. And she echoed Polley's unnerving parallel between both hair-raising Atwood adaptations, and explained what it was like bringing the story of Grace Marks to life. What initially drew you to the adaptation of Alias Grace? Well, I hadn't read the novel. I knew nothing about the story going in, I had no preconceptions about it. But it's such a fantastic plot. You get totally drawn into this world. I've always loved ambiguity and mystery, and also a female character who suffers a lot but isn't conventionally, like, oh, poor Grace. She's very complicated. Is she good? Is she bad? Have the things she suffered turned her into a murderer? All of these things. I was very drawn into the world right away. Were you a Margaret Atwood fan before this? Yeah, I'm Canadian, so of course. I was also at university in the 70s when her first novels started coming out. Or, at least, that's when I started discovering them. She had a big impact on feminism at the point of that generation. I was very affected by the stories that she was telling. But I hadn't read her most recent stuff. So it was a real revelation. Alias Grace is actually my favorite Margaret Atwood novel now. The novel is based on a real crime that happened in Canada in the 1840s. Were you aware of the story of Grace Marks at all? I read a couple reviews of Atwood's book when it came out, but I had never heard of Marks. It was very mysterious. I've done a lot of period drama. My first film, I Shot Andy Warhol, was the 1960s, Betty Page was the 1950s, American Psycho was the 1980s. I studied literature at university, I'm pretty steeped in the Victorian novel, so I always wanted to do a period drama like this. This is a very interesting take on a 19th century story. The story revolves around perhaps one of the most enigmatic characters Margaret Atwood ever wrote. If you could give your own character description of Grace Marks, what would it be? This is important. She's a young girl, Protestant, from Northern Ireland. She's very competent and capable and bright. She's the sort of person who could have run a corporation, but she's born into a world of incredible poverty and oppression, and she suffers greatly. She's quite puritanical, like a lot of Northern Irish Protestants. I can say that, because my family's from there. She has love in her heart, but the question is, with all her sufferings, did they make her a better person or a worse person? With all the terrible things that she has had to go through, which way did they turn her in the end? I had this conversation with Margaret Atwood. People think that suffering makes you noble, but not always. Sometimes, a lot of suffering can turn you. It can make you vindictive and murderous. You don't know. Yes, that's certainly one of the intriguing aspects of the way.